Good evening. We are delighted you are here for the first of a series of lectures on climate change and public policy. My name is John Graham, Dean of the School of Public and Environmental Affairs, and we're pleased that this lecture today is co-sponsored by the new School of Global and International Studies here at IU Bloomington and the World Resources Institute. We lead off with a very distinguished speaker, Dr. Rajendra Pachauri. He was born and raised in India, where he earned a college degree in mechanical engineering. After working with the government agency Indian Railways, he turned to the United States, where he pursued graduate studies and earned a master's and doctoral degrees in economics and engineering at North Carolina State University. He has held several faculty posts at universities in the U.S. and India, and has also served as an advisor to numerous corporations, nonprofit groups, and entire governments. He is perhaps best known for serving as chairperson of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a role he assumed in the year 2002. Under his leadership, the panel was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. More recently, he served as founding director of the Yale Climate and Energy Institute in New Haven, and Dr. Pachauri currently lives in New Delhi, where he works at one of the leading research institutes in India. On a personal note, Dr. Pachauri's biography notes that he is a strict vegetarian, largely because of the environmental and climate change implications of dietary choice. Sir, the floor is yours.
Dean Graham, faculty, Professor Abhyankar, ladies and gentlemen, and my young friends here, whose presence gives me an enormous amount of hope and inspiration. Dean Graham ended his very generous introduction by mentioning that I'm a strict vegetarian. But I also want to emphasize the fact that in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I have the privilege of chairing, we are told to be policy relevant but not policy prescriptive. So my vegetarianism is not in any way meant to be a prescription for anybody else to follow. I would like to say that it's a unique privilege for me to be here as the first in this series, which I think is extremely timely and pertinent given the kinds of challenges that we're facing worldwide across this entire planet. And I would like to give you some findings that have come out in the 3 working group reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which are part of the 5th assessment report which we're bringing out. The last part of this particular assessment cycle, the synthesis report, will be completed by the end of October, and that in a sense synthesizes the work of the 3 working group reports that's already been published. And I would like to request and urge all of you to go to the website of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and at least try to skim over the summary for policymakers for each of these reports. Because the summary for policymakers is, as the term indicates, a summary of the larger report, and those larger reports are about this thick each, and we call them the bricks. So I wouldn't want you to handle any of the bricks, but there's a little bit of the sort of essence of the findings of each report which is contained in the summary for policymakers. Let me start by giving you a little bit of introduction about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is a body which was established in 1988 because at that stage there was growing concern on the reality of climate change, and I think the global community decided that it would be most appropriate to utilize all the scientific talent from all over the world to assess and to understand what's happening to the climate of this planet, and to what extent are human beings responsible for altering it if it is being altered. Since then, the IPCC has brought out 4 assessment reports, and these are comprehensive reports. And as I mentioned, we are now on the verge of completion of the 5th assessment report. But other than that, we also bring out a large number of special reports. Just to give you an indication, in 2011, we brought out 2 special reports, one dealing with extreme events and disasters and how we might be able to adapt to them. And these are, of course, all climate-related extreme events and disasters, and I'll say a little bit about what came out of that report. We also brought out a special report on renewable energy sources and climate change mitigation, and that really brought us up to date on where renewable energy technologies are, what is the state of play as far as these are concerned, and where is it that they might be able to give us solutions in the future. So both of these reports also contained projections of the future. And that, may I say, is something that the IPCC does in all its reports. We study published literature and observations from the past, and we then also assess what's going to happen in the future on the basis of a set of scenarios. Just to tell you how we function, when, let's say, an assessment has to be carried out, like I mentioned the 5th assessment report, we start by carrying out what is called a scoping exercise. And the scoping exercise is essentially something that involves maybe 200 plus people who are experts, who are government officials, and those who might be able to bring some wisdom into designing the structure of the report. So we get together for 3 or 4 days or 5 days, and then come up with an outline of what the next report should really contain and should cover. Based on that, then the entire panel, and this consists of the 195 governments of the world, will look at the outline, they'll approve of the outline, and that gives us a signal to go ahead. And that's when we start writing to all the governments and international organizations, sending them the outline, the approved outline, and then asking for the bios of authors, of scientists who could work on the report. To give you a number, we had about 3,000 nominations for the 5th assessment report, and we selected 831 to actually work on the report. Now, this is not the only number that works on an IPCC assessment, because at each stage of drafting, we get expert reviewers. And almost anybody can register himself or herself as an expert reviewer. The expert reviewer basically gets the draft report, comments on it, and then we have a set of review editors who make sure that every single comment is taken into account, and the authors will have to record whether they accept the comment or reject it. If they reject it, they have to provide reasons for it. I'm giving you all these elaborate details only to mention that the IPCC functions in a very transparent manner, and in a manner that is totally objective. And we don't carry out any research on our own. What we do is to assess published literature, and on the basis of that, come up with a very clear understanding and a set of findings related to how the climate has changed, to what extent have human beings been responsible for that change, and how one could project the future. Now, having given you this broad background, let me give you a few findings of the 3 working group reports which have come out as part of the 5th assessment report. Well, the first thing that I'd like to mention is the fact that there's a 95% certainty or a 95% probability that most of the changes that have taken place since the middle of the last century have been the result of human actions. In what way? Well, human beings, through the economic activities that we have carried out, have been responsible for emissions of greenhouse gases, the bulk of which incidentally come from the burning of fossil fuels. And the concentration of these gases has gone up over a period of time. To give you a set of numbers, when industrialization began, we had 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this year, last year rather, in May of last year, the figure exceeded 400 parts per million. So that's been a very rapid increase in a very short period of time. And the changes that have taken place are unprecedented over decades to millennia. So in other words, what we've done in this relatively short period of time is something that hadn't happened over thousands of years. What are the manifestations of climate change? Well, for one thing, the atmosphere has warmed, the oceans have warmed, the global water cycle has changed, there have been reductions in snow and ice, there's been sea level rise, both as a result of melting of the bodies of ice and snow across the globe, but also because of thermal expansion of the oceans. And we've also experienced climate extremes, which incidentally are going to grow in the future. Now, let me tell you about changes in snow and ice. These have some major implications because if you look at the Arctic region, that's warming at twice the rate of the rest of the globe. And in fact, if you go to the Arctic region, the extent of sea ice cover that existed earlier on has depleted substantially. Our projections indicate that under certain scenarios, if we don't mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases, then by 2050, September sea ice could vanish from the Arctic completely. And I'm mentioning the month of September because that's clearly the month when you have the lowest amount of ice cover on the Arctic, because through the summer, there's a substantial amount of melting that takes place. But by 2050, the melting would occur to an extent that you would be left probably with no ice cover on the Arctic at all. The other point that I'd like to make excuse me, is that it's not just land areas that are warming, but the ocean has also warmed significantly. In fact, since 1970, about 90% of the heat that's been generated on account of global warming or climate change has gone into the oceans. And it's gone to a depth of 700 meters, and it's now going further down to other depths. This is based on observation, so it's not, there's no theorizing over here. All of these findings that we have come up with are based on measurements and observations that exist. Sea level rise, which I referred to as the result both of the melting of snow and ice across the globe, but also thermal expansion of the ocean, has averaged 19 centimeters since the beginning of the last century to the year 2010. Now, 19 centimeters may not seem very serious if you're in Indiana, but if you're living in Louisiana or in Florida, then clearly that does have some serious implications for several parts of these two states. And if you happen to be an inhabitant of the small island states, then clearly sea level rise even of 19 centimeters, which is close to a foot, not exactly a foot, could pose certain risks that are very significant. And I'll give you a little anecdote. It was in 1997 that I was elected as vice chair of the IPCC, and we met on the island nation of the Maldives, and the president of the Maldives, President Gayoom, at that time addressed us, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the area where you're holding your meeting today, 10 years ago was under 1.5 feet of water." So when you have an increase in the sea level, it's not just the fact that there is a danger of complete submergence, as indeed is happening in some parts of the small island states, but every time you have a storm surge, every time you have coastal flooding, that poses some risks to human beings as well as property. What are the drivers of change? Well, a large number of activities that we undertake result in emissions of greenhouse gases. It could be transport, certainly power generation, which, as you know, leads to emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Even agriculture could be a source of greenhouse gas emissions, because there are oxides of nitrogen that are emitted as a result of use of fertilizers and other chemicals. You have emissions from industry, and households are also responsible directly or indirectly to emissions of greenhouse gases. I want to highlight one particular sector, and that's agriculture, forestry, and land use, AFOLU as we refer to it. This sector accounts for about 24% of the emissions of greenhouse gases, and that's quite significant. And in the fifth assessment report, for the first time, I think we have emphasized the need to look at this sector with much greater seriousness than has been the case in the past. Why are we doing that? Well, firstly, because there is a substantial amount of deforestation taking place in several parts of the world. And there are issues of land use where, for instance, trees are being cut down to plant palm oil. Trees have been cut down. Large areas of rainforests have been cut down and cleared to create pasture land. And land use changes, therefore, are an important source of emissions of greenhouse gases, because trees, by the very process that is responsible for their growth and their existence, are able to absorb carbon dioxide to a large extent. Now, let me talk about some of the other impacts of climate change. There are important changes and impacts as far as agriculture is concerned. In fact, in the fifth assessment report, we have substantial new evidence on the impacts on agriculture. Wheat, corn, and rice in particular are very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And there's now growing evidence that there's a decline in yields with some of these crops as a result of climate change. There's an indirect impact also, and that's essentially because of changes in precipitation. I mentioned earlier that there are extreme events which are on the increase. Two types of extreme events in particular are increasing at a rate and at a frequency that certainly we need to be concerned about. Heat waves are on the increase, both in frequency and intensity, and extreme precipitation events. Now, in the case of heat waves, we have found that in some parts of the world, those heat waves which currently take place once in 20 years will, by the end of the century, if we don't do anything about this problem, occur once in 2 years. So you can imagine that, you're probably aware in 2003, there was a massive heat wave in and around Paris and in other parts of Europe, which led to a large number of deaths. And if such a heat wave, which possibly occurs maybe once in 20 years, once in 40 years, was to become more frequent, then clearly we would have to find measures by which we can deal with it. And that takes me to the important point about adapting to the impacts of climate change. As I mentioned earlier, climate change is taking place as a result of increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases. And this concentration is not going to change downwards in any short period of time, simply because even if we were to reduce emissions to current levels across the globe today, that concentration is not going to go down suddenly, and therefore climate change will continue for a few decades. And we would have no choice but to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So one important response measure that I think every community, every government, and every stakeholder group has to adopt across the globe is the need to adapt to the impacts of climate change. In the case of agriculture, which I know in this state is a very important activity, perhaps you need research and development by which you can come up with crops, you can come up with seed varieties that would be suitable for the revised conditions in the climate that are going to be met in the future. There would also have to be changes perhaps in cropping patterns and agricultural practices by which whatever changes take place, whether it's increase in temperature or precipitation patterns, we're able to deal with it effectively. But when I talk about precipitation patterns, I want to emphasize the fact that there's been an increase in extreme precipitation events. And our projections indicate that these will increase in frequency and intensity as time goes on if we don't deal with the problem of climate change, if we don't mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, in the case of these extreme precipitation events, our assessment is that under certain scenarios, even those areas where you have an actual decline in the average precipitation levels, the bulk of it will occur in the form of extreme precipitation. Now, that has major implications not only for the risk that extreme precipitation might bring about. There have been cases where heavy rainfall, particularly on a slope which is heavily deforested, leads to mudslides, and that has major dangers. You would also have rainfall itself causing flooding that clearly threatens lives. But what is equally important is the fact that you're not able to impound that water. How do you make sure that all that precipitation which is going to occur in a shorter period of time and with a much heavier intensity can lead to collection of that water for normal uses that we are all accustomed to and that the economy depends on. So I think we have to deal with adaptation both in respect of, let's say, what's going to happen to agriculture, what's going to happen to human health, because vector-borne diseases are going to increase with heat waves. Possibly there would be health effects that we have to be concerned about. But we also have to deal with impacts that are necessarily going to have to deal with an increase in these extreme events. But all of this is fine if we look at the oceans, which have not received the attention that they deserve in the past. There are other factors that have to be taken into account. For instance, 30% of the emissions of greenhouse gases that have taken place since the beginning of industrialization have gone into the oceans. So 30% of the carbon dioxide that's been emitted since the beginning of industrialization has gone into the oceans. And that's leading to ocean acidification. And if this trend continues, there are serious implications for marine ecosystems, for marine life. And combined with the fact that there's also an increase in temperature and the oceans are warming, clearly fish stocks that existed in some parts of the world will now migrate to other regions which are more hospitable to them in terms of their existence. This obviously will have implications for the livelihood of fishermen in different parts of the world, evidence of which is already available. Two other points I'd like to mention by way of the impacts of climate change. One is the increased threat to displacement of people, because obviously if conditions are going to change, people may be displaced. These conditions could be in the nature of extreme precipitation, droughts, heat waves, impacts on agriculture, because please do consider the fact that a large number of farmers, particularly in the developing world, are totally dependent on rain-fed agriculture. They don't have recourse to irrigation. And therefore, if rainfall patterns are going to change, some of them may not be able to grow enough food to meet their own needs and the needs of their families. And they would therefore have no choice but to move away from where they are. So I'm giving you just one example of the drivers that lead to displacement. And these are drivers that exist even today, because there's a substantial amount of poverty in several parts of the world. And those who are poor are in any case living on the edge. Climate change and its impacts only exacerbate those conditions. So it could be a multiplier of the threat that leads to displacement. It could also be the multiplier of threats that lead to conflict. Because if conditions become very difficult for communities to be able to live as they've been doing in the past, and for them to coexist, then clearly the danger of conflict will also go up. Now, having told you all this, what is it that we can do? I mentioned the requirement of adaptation to be able to deal with the impacts of climate change in the coming few decades. But we must remember that beyond a certain point, adaptation would become very challenging and almost impossible. So therefore, at the same time, it's crucially important that we reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases and bring about a stabilization of the climate. And as the aspirational goal which has been set by the negotiators under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change clearly states, we would have to limit temperature increase to about 2 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. Now, if that were to be done, then the actions that we require for mitigation would, for instance, require that we treble or quadruple low carbon and zero carbon sources of energy supply from renewables. So this, to my mind, is a challenge for human society, and for businesses, and for research and development organizations, and for institutions like universities, particularly this remarkable university, because you need to develop technologies that are economically viable, that are technically feasible, and these can then provide us with substitute forms of energy supply. We have also found that if we want to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius, then it's going to be absolutely essential that we not only bring down emissions of greenhouse gases to zero by the end of this century, but actually go into negative emissions. How can we do that? Well, there are various means by which that would be possible. Firstly, as far as energy supply is concerned, renewables will have to be used, possibly nuclear, wherever society is willing to go in for nuclear. We'll have to stop deforestation. We'll have to expand forestry, areas under forestry. And we would also need carbon capture and storage. These are some of the technological options that we'll have to create for ourselves and that we'll have to disseminate on a wide scale. So, carbon capture and storage, bioenergy, where I think this state can really take the lead with innovations that go into second generation, third generation biofuels. All of these are options that human society will have to evaluate and adopt so that we can keep temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius. This, of course, will require some policy initiatives because, for instance, if you want to signal to consumers and producers what is required for the future to deal with climate change, then the price mechanism has to convey that. You would also possibly have to convey that through means such as regulation. But by far, the most efficient way of doing that would be to see that prices clearly indicate the value that you attach to high carbon versus low carbon fuels, and it's only on that basis that you would move in the direction of sustainable development and a stable climate for this planet. Now, I would like to quote from Mahatma Gandhi, who said, "A technological society has two choices. First, it can wait until catastrophic failures expose systemic deficiencies, distortion, and self-deceptions." So, if we follow one set of choices, then clearly we'll just wait till catastrophic failures expose to us the kinds of flaws that we have in our thinking and our actions. But secondly, a culture can provide social checks and balances to correct for systemic distortion prior to catastrophic failures. And I think in a knowledge society, this really has to be the guidepost for all the actions that we undertake, because it's really on the basis of knowledge that human society exercises enlightenment in taking steps that avoid, minimize, and eliminate risk of any kind. And if we don't do that, then clearly we would have to face some of the risks in the future. And this, may I say, is not alien to decision making in any field. When a businessman takes a decision to invest in something, you don't have 100% probability of success, but you take a risk because you feel that maybe there's a 60 or 70% probability that a business venture will be absolutely successful, and you go ahead and do it. It's on the basis of an assessment of the future. It's on the basis of you're evaluating the risks associated with a particular set of actions, and obviously that's how you come out being successful. But I would also like to end by saying that what we need is a set of new metrics and measures by which we define and evaluate human progress as it takes place. Because take, for instance, the fact that climate change is the result of what we might say is an exploitation of the global commons. We are using the atmosphere by dumping a whole lot of gases into the atmosphere that obviously human society was not responsible for before industrialization. So we've got benefits from industrialization. We enjoy using the telephone, we enjoy using the camera, we enjoy getting the benefits of drugs and pharmaceuticals and everything that modern life has brought to us. But at the same time, we have deforested some of the best rainforests in the world. We have clearly polluted the atmosphere. We have polluted our waterways. We have acidified the oceans. We have cut a number of trees. And these are things that really that are not taken into account in the measurement of GDP, the gross domestic product. So we also need to come up with measures by which, yes, we can look at the GDP, but we should also look at how we're really imposing costs on some of the global commons, on some of the natural resources that exist across the globe, because the services that these natural resources and ecosystems provide to us are really invaluable. These are something that are very much an essential input to all human activities, including economic activities. And therefore, we need to come up with metrics by which we take some of these impacts, some of these negative externalities that we're imposing on the environment fully into account. And it was in this context that Gandhi said that speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction. Now, of course, those of you who've traveled to India would probably know that everybody over there drives on the wrong side of the road, and they don't drive slowly, they go pretty fast. So that certainly is irrelevant, and I think human society has to avoid that situation by moving in the right direction and measuring speed in the right lane on the right side of the road. Before I end, I do want to pay a tribute to the late Professor Elinor Ostrom, who, may I say, was a good friend, someone that all of us looked up to. And I'm very proud to mention that, of course, she got so many honors, including the Nobel Prize. But we're very fortunate and we're very proud of the fact that the last honor that she received was an honorary doctorate from my university, Terry University in New Delhi. And I do want to pay tribute to her. She is a person who enriched our knowledge on issues of common property resource, on issues that, most economists, most philosophers and thinkers don't even focus on. And it's really wonderful to be here in this university to which she devoted her life and, of course, gave so much to humanity at large. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those very clear and concise remarks, and we very much appreciated the mention of Elinor Ostrom, who we're all very proud of. What we have now is a period of time for comment and discussion and question and answer. We have microphone up here, and we have microphone over here. And those of you who are interested, you need to get into line because we're only going to be able to take a certain number of these. And I will alternate from one side to the other, and you should direct those to our speaker. So I see a gentleman already up there quickly at the microphone, and the floor is yours for the first question or comment.
My question is about the role of population growth in climate change, and this population growth has been quite uneven around the world, as you know. Some parts of the world have hardly any population growth aside from migration. Other parts have quite considerable population growth. What can we do as people of the world to make sure that population does not grow too much in certain areas of the world and threaten the climate of the entire world?
No, I think that's a very relevant question, sir. And if you look at population growth, then at the beginning of the 20th century, the total population of the world was barely 2 billion. We are now in excess of 7 billion and heading to God knows where, 9 billion, 10 billion, we don't know. And the main drivers of emissions of greenhouse gases are economic activity and economic growth as well as population growth. And I think given the fact that we have this inertia, this momentum in population growth, which may help us stabilize or take us to a stabilized figure of maybe 9 billion, it's absolutely essential that the pattern of growth that we adopt is such that minimizes our footprint on the natural resources of this planet. Now, what can one do to slow down population growth? Well, you take the example of China, where you have a centralized system of government, where something is mandated and it is implemented, and they have been able to stabilize their population growth through their one-child norm. But in democratic societies, the only thing that works, in my view, is good health care and education of the girl child. I can mention that on the basis of experience in India, the states, largely in southern India, have gone in for universal education and literacy, and that has had a dramatic impact on fertility rates, because girls who go through school and are educated have a very different fertility behavior from those who haven't had that benefit. So in my view, I think every country in the world has to ensure that we educate the girl child, we make sure that there's a safety net in terms of healthcare systems by which people don't have large-scale infant mortality, and therefore, you don't have 4 or 5 children because there is the expectation some may not survive. And I think there's a whole range of other psychological factors also that would have to contribute to stabilization of population. So I hope governments and people all over the world realize the benefits of education per se. Population is just one benefit. There are several other benefits that follow.
Okay. Thank you. First, Dr. Pachauri, I'd like to thank you for your inspiring and indispensable work. My question is, as you pointed out in the lecture, some of the world's poorest people will be the most affected by climate change. We in Indiana, both historically and currently, have some of the highest per capita emissions in terms of causing the problem. What is the responsibility of the rich countries to make restitution to the world's poor and the world's impacted, both in the interests of justice and of national and global security?
Well, that's a complex question, but a very relevant one. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has, in light of what you said, specified responsibility as being common but differentiated responsibility. And I can say that progress in sort of defining and implementing this has been rather slow. When I had the privilege of accepting the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the IPCC, in my acceptance speech, I invoked a Sanskrit phrase which essentially translated means the universe is one family. And I think we have lost that sense of reality, because I think we are living in a globalized world where impacts such as those of climate change in one part of the globe will in some form or the other will visit us wherever we are. If you take some of the conflicts that are taking place in different parts of the world, and they are not necessarily related to climate change, we all are concerned. We all have to be bothered about them, because in some form or the other they also affect our welfare. So I think what we really need is universal understanding of the fact that we are all members of spaceship Earth, and there's no other planet that we can go to. A couple of evenings ago, I was with Sir Richard Branson, who, as you know, is planning to go into outer space and is going to take a large number of people with him. But even he has no ambitions of looking for another planet which we could make our own home. So I think what we really need is initiative by the leaders of various faiths in the world, political leaders, and I would say most importantly, institutions like this, to create this sense of universal responsibility by which we realize that each one of us is part of the same family. And if somebody in the family is suffering, you shouldn't turn your face away from that. Thank you.
You mentioned early in your talk that a considerable amount of climate change is due to individual action, either directly or indirectly.
Yeah, in fact, that's quite a challenge. You see, the scientific community is so steeped in the practice of writing scientific articles and papers and, peer-reviewed publications that I'm afraid we don't always do a very good job of writing things that the average person on the street can understand. What we're trying to do this time around is to have partner organizations pick up our products, convert them into something that's understandable to lay persons. And we're also trying very hard in the synthesis report which we're working on and which, as I said, will be completed at the end of October, to write it in language that is simple, non-technical. I hope we succeed to a large degree. And this is also a very small document. We try to make it as thin as possible so that you can literally read it sitting in a car if you're being driven from. I wouldn't advise that if you're driving. Between here and, let's say, the airport in Indianapolis. So that's the manner in which we're producing this document. But I still feel that there's a lot that needs to be converted into far simpler language. And we're hoping some partner organizations will do that. But you pointed at something which clearly has been a shortfall on the part of what we have produced in the past.
My question pertains to the fact that you mentioned that we have to develop our carbon tracking schemes, whereas isn't that considered a short-term solution because you can't exactly store carbon for a very extended period of time because there will be needs, there will be damage to the structure, and again, people are releasing it into the environment.
You're absolutely right. Carbon capture and storage is still not a commercially viable technology. It's still not free of risk. I mean, its reliability is questionable. But what we're saying is that by the end of the century, that may be one of the solutions. And the only way we can create that solution is if there's enough spent on research and development and demonstration projects and getting rid of some of the flaws, some of the uncertainties related to that technology. I think it's well within the means of human capability and ingenuity to be able to do that. So we're laying this down as a menu, which I hope the business community and the research and development community will pick up and work on in the future. But you're right, this is not a technology that's available at this point of time and certainly cannot be implemented on a large scale. But it may be absolutely crucial in the decades ahead.
So I think renewable energy is awesome, but it currently costs more per unit energy than fossil fuel energy. So how do we reflect the true cost of fossil fuel energy without recessing the economy, or is that a myth in your opinion?
Well, I think there are two things that I would say in response. Firstly, there are several niche areas where renewable energy is viable today. And I'll give you an example. There are 1.3 billion people in the world who have no access to electricity. Now, if we were to wait till they are supplied electricity through the conventional means, 3 generations will go by. But today you have decentralized renewable energy technologies which make it possible for these people to get decent, clean, durable lighting. And my own institute is involved in a major program which we call Lighting a Billion Lives, wherein what we do is to train, for instance, a woman in a village to charge a bunch of solar lanterns during the daytime using a solar panel on her roof, and then she rents them out at night. Now, the cost of rental is no more than what a typical household would pay by way of kerosene. So this is clearly a viable option for some sections of society who don't have access to electricity. And of course, we've had to design these lanterns in a way that are low cost, that are lightweight, and that use LED. And the other benefit that they have is that you can also plug in your cell phone in that particular lantern. Because as you know, there's been an explosion of the cell phone market all over the world. Whether you go to Africa, India, Vietnam, wherever, you'll find people in rural areas, they may have no other piece of equipment, but they have a cell phone. And to get it charged in areas where you don't have electricity is a hassle, because you've got to get batteries. People will set up a shop to charge your telephone. Here, if you have a solar lantern in your home, you can charge your phone also. So, you know, this is working extremely well. And this is the kind of niche market that I think can be exploited worldwide. Things like rooftop solar in areas where you have plenty of sunshine all the year around. It's a win-win situation. So that's one set of solutions. The other set of solutions, of course, lies in research and development and economies of scale. Because with economies of scale, you've seen what's happened to photovoltaic costs. There really hasn't been substantial R&D in this area, but since we're producing many more panels today, costs have come down significantly. So clearly, if the world wants to move towards renewable sources of energy, then governments, businesses, and other entities will have to spend a lot more in making these technologies commercially viable. And that certainly will take large-scale R&D, demonstration, and better engineering over a period of time. So that's a challenge that I think has yet to be met.
First, Mr. Pachauri, thank you for that inspiring and informative talk. I had the honor of visiting your university in Bloomington. Doing great work.
Thank you.
So I wonder if you would care to comment on reports we are hearing now about the melting of the Arctic permafrost and the release of huge amounts of methane gases that could lead to levels of climate change that might render any talk of human activity at the end of the century irrelevant.
No, that clearly is a risk. And in fact, there are several of these irreversible and abrupt changes that can really cause very serious problems to this globe. And you know, as risk averters, we don't necessarily have to pinpoint a date and a time when that's going to happen. I think the very fact that this is a strong possibility if we don't change things should be enough reason for us to start taking action on the basis of the precautionary principle. And I expect that if awareness was to spread all over the world on the impacts of climate change and how they're going to affect all our lives, and the benefits of taking action, which really is not going to be expensive. One of the things I didn't mention in my talk is the fact that if we were to move along a pathway by which we mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases to contain temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius, then by 2030, the loss in consumption globally would be a median value of no more than 1.7% of the global consumption. So, you know, that's not a very heavy price to pay for avoiding some of the worst impacts of climate change. And there are also several co-benefits. You would have higher energy security, you would have lower levels of pollution at the local level, possibly higher levels of employment. So, you know, I think people have to realize that these risks can easily be avoided if we start taking action today. And I think that's, again, something where universities can get involved in a big way.
Hello. So seeing all of these great portents and hearing all of these very big scale changes that are occurring and that are going to continue to occur, some of them that feel almost unavoidable for younger generations that are growing up within this sphere. And I know at least here in Bloomington, a lot of people recycle and cycle and try to be as healthy as possible. What can
Well, I feel very encouraged and very optimistic about young people all over the world because I think it's your future which is at stake. You have an enormous amount of power, you have a voice where you can not only show things that need to be done in your personal lives, if we are more responsible in the use of energy, in the use of transportation, in the way we consume, we can really make a difference. But more importantly, I think in your areas of activity, including campuses, you could really start a movement whereby you can cut down emissions of greenhouse gases, you can monitor these, measure them carefully. Well, I've been at Yale. This was a part-time arrangement, but I was going back and forth all the time, and of course expanding my own carbon footprint in doing that. I have to confess that. But the student community over there has become very active, and they're doing everything possible to make the campus sustainable. Now, that's not an easy task, but I think if you keep at it, you can not only carry back lessons from what you do over there, and you're all going to become very responsible officials, managers, scientists. You can make a difference in your own sphere of activity, but you're also influencing the community all around. People will see what you're able to do on your own campus. So maybe the dean will not give me a rap on the knuckles for creating this kind of rebellion over here. But I think there's a lot. I mean, again, I always quote Gandhi. He used to say, be the change you want to see in the world. So I think we have to be that change.
Two more, and then we will call it an evening.
Hi. My question is related to the UN framework Dimensional Climate Change and how well they've been meeting for decades and how very little concrete sort of governments coming together has really happened over that period of time. So my question to you is for how long you've been engaging in this area, or in the sphere of climate change. Have you seen a change in public dialogue, or you think understanding of climate change? And then sort of the second part to that, do you think there is hope for an agreement to be made through the UNFCCC, between world governments developing the developed world?
Well, yes, of course, we are going to see the 20th Conference of the Parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change taking place at the end of this year. And the 21st will take place next year, when it's expected that an agreement will be reached. And naturally, questions arise whether that will actually happen or not. My own belief is that I see an unprecedented level of awareness all over the world. And I think there are also several examples of successful action in cities, towns, states, provinces, and countries, which to my mind will provide a level of confidence by which hopefully the global community will reach an agreement. But may I also say that while a global agreement is very important, I think there's a lot that perhaps needs to be done at the national, the subnational, and the local level all over the world. Because all of this is really going to add up to action that really reduces the emissions of greenhouse gases and helps us to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So I am not saying that we don't need an agreement, we possibly do, but I think that should not be something that stands between us and taking action at our own levels, nationally, subnationally, and locally. And there's a lot of that happening. So I'm optimistic. I have a feeling that next year in Paris, you will get an agreement, and I hope it will be an effective agreement, which provides a message to all of humanity on the direction in which we need to move.
Okay, one more.
Thank you for coming in here and speaking.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, I'm one of the main graduate students that have come here for advocacy to speak. Where do you think are the most important areas as something coming up that we be focusing and developing our expertise to help confront climate change?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Where do you think, as young people, we should be focusing our development of expertise to confront climate change?
Where should we be? You mean a university should be focusing on?
Young people.
Oh, young people. Oh, well, like I said earlier, I think young people can really be focusing their attention at different levels. Firstly, in pursuing lifestyles and personal choices that are responsible in keeping this planet in good shape. Secondly, in the communities where they are involved, showing through their own actions that on a community basis, on a collective basis, we can make a difference. And thirdly, I really think you can shame adults into doing the right things. I mean, you have no idea how much power you have. If you tell adults to do something, and whether it's, and I'm not saying that you go against your parents, but parents included, there are things that you can tell them to do, and their friends and your relations. I think you can really be at the sort of vanguard of change that's required worldwide. So you really need a combination of actions. What's also perhaps important is for you to create awareness across the globe. People will listen to children. I'm going to be speaking at the summit that the UN Secretary General is organizing on the 23rd of September, this month itself in New York. And I'm very happy to learn that in the opening session, when the Secretary General speaks, and I will be speaking also briefly, I may have the luxury of speaking for 3 minutes or 5 minutes. We're still negotiating on it. But there's also going to be a young person who's going to provide a message. And I think it's very important because you have 120 to 130 world leaders sitting over there. They must listen to the voice of youth to express their concerns, their aspirations, and their exhortations on what adults should do. So I think if you do that day in and day out, you all can become, the torch bearers of change across the globe. And I wish you all the best.